Right now, somewhere in the world, a person is lying awake at 2 a.m. thinking about work, about deadlines, about performance reviews, about whether they are doing enough, earning enough, becoming enough, about the alarm that is going to go off in a few hours and pull them back into a system they never chose and never fully understood. Here is a question no one ever asks that question. What did your ancestors do before any of that existed? Not in the romantic way, not the fantasy of hammocks and sunsets. The real answer, the archaeological answer, the answer that comes from studying the actual daily structure of human life before agriculture, before cities, before employment, before the entire architecture of modern obligation was built around your nervous system. Because what your ancestors actually did with their time is not what you have been told. And understanding it might be the most clarifying thing you learn this year. Let us start with the hours. Anthropologist Marshall Sahlins at the University of Chicago published a landmark study in 1972 that overturned almost everything the Western world assumed about prehistoric human life. His analysis of surviving hunter-gatherer societies, including the Kung San people of the Kalahari and the Arnhem Land Aboriginal communities in Australia, produced a finding so counterintuitive it was initially rejected by many of his colleagues. Ancient humans, living in conditions that modern people would consider extreme poverty, worked an average of 3 to 5 hours per day to meet all of their survival needs. 3 to 5 hours. To eat, to maintain shelter, to care for their families, to handle everything the modern world requires 40 or more hours a week to approximate. Sahlins called hunter-gatherer societies the original affluent society, not because they had abundance in the material sense, but because they had the one thing modern humans consistently report they do not have enough of: time. The remaining hours of the day were not wasted. They were not idle, but they were radically different from anything the modern work paradigm would recognize as productive. Your ancestors talked at extraordinary length. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner at the University of Utah conducted a landmark study analyzing the conversation patterns of the Kung San people across different times of day. She found that daytime conversations were dominated by practical matters, resource locations, tool maintenance, group logistics, but evening conversations around the fire were almost entirely stories, narrative, character discussion, speculation about other people's intentions and motivations. What researchers now recognize as the primary mechanism by which ancient humans built and maintained the large complex social networks that were their primary survival tool. In other words, your ancestors spent a significant portion of every day doing what the modern world calls doing nothing: talking, listening, telling stories, building the social infrastructure of the group. They also played. The archaeological record is full of evidence of games, toys, decorative objects, and musical instruments that serve no survival function whatsoever. A 40,000-year-old vulture bone flute found in the Swabian Jura region of Germany. Ochre-painted shells used as jewelry dating back over 75,000 years in South Africa. Game boards carved into rock surfaces across multiple ancient cultures. Your ancestors were not grinding from dawn to dusk. They were singing. They were adorning themselves. They were playing games with each other and teaching those games to their children. They walked, not as exercise in the modern sense, not as a deliberate health intervention, but as the natural default state of a body that had evolved for constant low-intensity movement. Researcher Herman Pontzer at Duke University has spent years studying the energy expenditure of the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last remaining truly hunter-gatherer societies on Earth. His findings turn the modern fitness industry on its head. The Hadza do not burn dramatically more calories than sedentary Western office workers, but they move constantly, walking, carrying, squatting. The movement is never intense, never scheduled, never framed as exercise. It is simply the texture of existence. They made things, slowly, without deadlines. The craftsmanship embedded in ancient tools, beads, clothing, and shelters represents not a rushed production process but what researchers describe as a fundamentally different relationship with time and output. When there is no clock, when there is no performance metric, when the only standard is whether the thing works and whether it is beautiful, the act of making becomes meditation. Researcher Ellen Dissanayake, who spent her career studying the evolutionary origins of art, argues that the making of things, the deliberate shaping of material into something beyond its functional necessity, was not a luxury for ancient humans. It was a psychological need, as fundamental to well-being as food or shelter. They slept differently. Sleep researcher Jerome Siegel at UCLA conducted a landmark study of sleep patterns in 3 non-industrialized societies, including the Hadza, the San people of Namibia, and the Tsimane people of Bolivia. His findings demolished the modern mythology of the 8-hour night. Ancient humans did not sleep in a single consolidated block. They went to sleep hours after dark. They woke in the night, sometimes briefly, sometimes for extended periods of quiet wakefulness or low-intensity social interaction. They napped. Their total sleep was actually slightly less than modern recommendations, around 6.5 hours on average, but it was distributed differently, woven into the day rather than imposed upon it as a single non-negotiable block. If you wake at 3 a.m. and cannot fall back asleep, you are not broken. You are running a sleep pattern that served your species for 200,000 years. The modern expectation of 8 unbroken hours is the anomaly. They healed. Ancient societies built elaborate systems of care around illness, injury, grief, and transition that involved the whole community. The isolation of the sick, the grieving, and the struggling into private spaces where they managed their distress alone and returned to productivity as quickly as possible is entirely a modern invention. Anthropologist and physician Paul Farmer spent his career documenting how pre-industrial societies understood health as fundamentally communal. You were not sick alone. You recovered in the presence of your group. The healing was social before it was physical. They were bored. This is perhaps the most important and least discussed fact about ancient human daily life. There were long stretches of nothing, waiting for prey, waiting for rain, waiting for a child to sleep, sitting with nothing to look at except fire and the faces of the people beside you. Modern research on boredom and creativity, including work by psychologist Sandy Mann at the University of Central Lancashire, strongly suggests that boredom is not a problem to be solved. It is a neurological state that generates creativity, reflection, and the kind of slow diffuse thinking that produces insight. Your brain was not built for constant stimulation. It was built for the kind of deep aimless contemplation that only becomes possible when the inputs stop. The phone in your pocket, the one you reach for the moment any boredom arrives, is doing something to your cognitive architecture that ancient humans never had to contend with. It is eliminating the spaces in which your best thinking happens. And then there is the question of purpose. Your ancestors did not need to find meaning in their work because their work was not separable from their life. The thing you did to eat was also the thing you did with the people you loved, in the landscape you had grown up in, using the skills your parents had taught you, in a way that would be remembered in the stories told about you after you were gone. The act of survival and the act of meaning were the same act. This is the thing that no modern job can fully replicate. Not because employers are evil, not because the economy is broken, but because the structural separation of survival from meaning, of labor from community, of productivity from purpose, is a feature of the last 10,000 years. And your brain is still running the software of the 200,000 years before that. You were not built for what you are doing, but you were built with everything you need to find your way back to what matters. The people who knew how to live were not waiting for the weekend. They were not saving up their real lives for retirement. They were not deferring joy until they had earned it or achieved it or optimized it. They were sitting around a fire in the dark, talking to the people they loved, making beautiful things for no audience, sleeping when they were tired, moving when they needed to move, and letting the long slow unscheduled hours of a human day be exactly what a human day is supposed to be. You already know this. You have always known this. The discomfort you feel on Sunday evening is not a character flaw. It is not a failure of discipline or gratitude. It is the sound of a 200,000-year-old nervous system telling you that something about the shape of your days does not match the shape of your nature. Now you know where that feeling comes from.